So far we've talked about the gear, we've talked about the camera settings, we've talked about how your motion of subject is playing out in front of it and your intervals. Now let's take this to a whole new level and move the camera through three-dimensional space. We're going to start talking about motion control. When it comes to motion control, there are a lot of different units out there. The one I'm personally using is one from a company called Dynamic Perceptions. These guys are based out of the US, out of Michigan in fact, and a lot of the products, in fact everything they do, is all done in-house, so they have pretty high quality control overall. The system I'm using from them is carbon rails that I can really disassemble down to 20 inches, or I have up to 10 feet of rail that I can use if I need to. The way this is gonna work more or less is I'll have the camera on this little carriage. It's gonna move across the rail system and I'll have a motor powering all of that. It uses a belt, and because of that, it can really hold pretty well. The hardest part of setting up a rail system, at least with tripods for me, is making sure it's balanced and all 6 of the feet from the different tripods are on the ground. Now, I have a very supportive little tripod here that's going to help me get really low and keep the system very stable. If you have something that isn't really able to take the weight of your gear and it moves a tiny bit, that's going to show up during your time lapse. I want everything to look as consistent as possible here. Now, one thing you really want to think about is the lens you're choosing in this aspect. I'm using, in a lot of cases, a really wide-angle lens. In this case, I'm using a 21mm Loxia lens from Zeiss. This is going to give me the ability to have maybe slightly larger movements, and if something's right in front of the camera, you won't see it get really choppy. By using an f/22 on this lens, I can keep things very close in focus, and I can actually dial in my focus on here. And it's moving smoothly. In this case, it's a little too bright though for the exposure that I want, so I'm going to have to use a neutral density or an ND filter. That's going to take some of the light away from the scene, and it's going to allow me to use the shutter speed that I want to use. Now, we haven't really talked too much about these ND filters, but the neutral density is an essential tool for these types of time lapses. When we're using these longer shutter speeds that really give us that smooth motion, anytime you're out during daytime, you're going to have one of these on there. This one, like any, I'm going to clean before I pop on. At f/22 especially, if there's dust on here, that may show up in this time lapse. We want it to look as nice as possible. Now this just uses a little motor that drops into the placement behind the camera, and then it's going to use an app that controls this through a little controller box, and that will also control the camera shutter. That's going to make sure that the movement and the shutter going off don't happen at the same time. It just uses a simple battery to control it, and these things can last for a really long time. The last bit's just plugging in that motor to the controller unit and then firing up the app to tell it how to work. Now the app will what they call an MX controller, and it's going to communicate wirelessly through either iOS or through Android. Now I'm just going to tell it where I want it to start, which is exactly where I have it right now. Set start, and then I'm going to move it to the position I want for ending. So I'm going to move her up the rail. Now if you're doing live time video, you can have this system just run continuously. Right now in that shoot move shoot that I'm using, it's going to stop between each exposure for the time lapse. And now that it's all set up, I'm just going to go ahead and start program, and it's going to move the rail for me, and it's going to trigger the camera between each one. Currently I'm using a rail, which is a single axis of motion that we're adding to this. It's panning across starting behind the bush, and it's revealing the park as we go. There's cars that are pulling out in the background there, and that's what we've exposed for since it's the brightest part. As long as I don't lose the detail there, and I can make sure I can bring up those shadows later on, I have enough information to make a really good looking time lapse. I'm going to switch to a 35mm lens. That's going to narrow us in on the cars moving when we get later on to the far side of this time lapse, but it's also going to bring that bush a little bit closer overall. We're going to keep that same increment that we've been using between this, and you might see a little bit more choppiness to this time lapse because that more telephoto lens with the same distance from the subject appears like we're moving in larger increments. Before we were using motion control, but with a rail for a single axis. This is also a single axis because it's only moving on one plane, but now we're panning instead of using that rail. Now I have a different type of ND filter with me, and it's called a variable neutral density. For video or for applications like this, where you might be carrying multiple neutral densities around, these can be really handy. On the technical side, these are really two polarizers cross-polarizing. In the non-technical side, that means it gets darker as you rotate this. By turning the filter, I can change it from the darker to lighter neutral density to suit my needs right now. Now there can be a negative effect to this, so I'm going to rotate this and pull out a lot of density here. But now you can start to see these wave symbols, and that's actually the waves of light being interrupted by this filter. So there are limitations to how dense you can get this before it really starts falling apart. I'm going to go ahead and set my start and end points just like I did before. Tell it exactly where I want to go. Now, there's another way we can play with this too. Not only are we going to be dealing with a rail, but we're also going to bring in a second axis of motion to this. So we'll have the camera moving across the rail, and then we'll have another head moving the camera, following, in this case, the Milky Way as the moon sets. This is an example in Utah, and we have the rail moving from right to left across the surreal landscape, while the panning head is moving from left to right, following the Milky Way across the sky. As the moon sets, you can really start to see that Milky Way panning. So with motion control, we've added an entirely new dynamic to these. Now we've got a lot of elements playing out in front of the viewer. If we take this even further, now we're going to start playing what's known as the Holy Grail in the next episode. We're going to do some transitions from daytime to nighttime, and we'll even talk a little bit about how to process these.